The church was so quiet I could hear the candles. That's not a metaphor. 37 candles in iron holders along the walls, and I could hear them, the tiny hiss and flutter of each flame, because 200 people had stopped breathing at the exact same moment. I didn't understand why yet. I had my back to the doors. I was watching Mia walk toward me, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And the string quartet was playing something I can't remember the name of, and I was standing there thinking, I made it. I actually made it through all of it, and I'm here. Then I heard my best man Tobias make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Something between a breath and a warning, right behind my left ear. I turned, and I saw her. Lena was standing at the back of the church in a green dress, both hands folded in front of her, completely still. Not frantic, not breathless, not nervous. She had the posture of someone who had been waiting a very long time for a door to open and was simply satisfied that it finally had. She looked at me across the full length of that church, and she smiled. That smile is the thing I keep coming back to. Not what she said, not what happened after. That smile. Small, controlled, almost private. Because it told me everything before a single word was spoken. It told me she had been here before in her mind. It told me she had rehearsed how she would look, where she would stand, how long she would hold the silence before she moved. It told me this was not an impulse. I turned back to Mia, and Mia was reading my face. She hadn't seen Lena yet. She was looking at me, and whatever she saw in my expression, whatever left my face in that half second, I watched it hit her. I watched her go very still in a completely different way than she'd been still a moment before. Then she turned, slowly, to look at what was behind her. That moment, the moment Mia turned, that was when it was already over. I just didn't know it yet. I need to back up. Not far, just enough. My name is Lucas. I'm 31. On the day my wedding came apart, I had been with Mia Fisher for 18 months, and I had been out of a relationship with Lena Brandt for 17 months before that. And somewhere in the gap between those two timelines, I had made a decision. Just one, quiet, private decision that I had buried so carefully I had almost stopped knowing it was there. Lena knew about that decision, and she had spent the last 3 months deciding what to do with it. I'll tell you about Lena because you need to understand what she is before you can understand what she did. She is not a villain in the way stories usually make people villains. She's not unhinged, she's not dramatic. She is, in a very specific way, one of the most controlled people I have ever encountered. In 3 years together, I never once saw her lose her composure in public. She saved the cold for private spaces, for Tuesday nights in the kitchen, for the drive home from someone's birthday party. In public, she was magnetic. She made people feel lit up. She asked the exact right questions. She remembered names, details, preferences. Not because she was kind, I understand now, but because information was how she operated. We broke up in February, 17 months before the wedding. Parking lot of a restaurant. I'd been building toward it for 6 months and pretending not to be, and finally I just said it out loud in a car park under fluorescent lights. She listened. She looked at me. Then she said, "Okay, Lucas." And she left. No yelling, no crying, no scene, just okay. That one word, that one flat okay, followed me for months. Because it didn't sound like acceptance. It sounded like a file being closed. 3 months later, I met Mia at a work event, and I don't want to make it sound like she was a reaction to Lena, because she deserves more than that. But I will say this. Sitting across from Mia Fisher for the first time felt like taking off a piece of clothing I hadn't known I was wearing. She was warm without being performed. She was perceptive without weaponizing it. When she went quiet, it was because she was thinking, not because she was calibrating damage. I had forgotten what it felt like to be around someone who wasn't always 3 moves ahead. We moved fast, engaged at 13 months. My mother, Ingrid, said she was happy for me. And then she said it. "I just want to make sure you're certain, Lucas," with a particular emphasis on certain that I didn't stop to examine. I told her I was, She nodded in a way that had something unresolved in it. I let it go. I was in love. I had a venue deposit down. I had flowers to pick. God, I let so many things go. The warning started 6 weeks before the wedding, and I dismissed every single one. First, an unknown number texted me, "I hope you know what you're doing." I deleted it without replying. Second, Tobias, at my bachelor party, 3 drinks in, put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I'd had any recent contact with Lena. Very careful voice, very deliberate phrasing. I said no. He said, "Okay, good," and nodded like he was filing something away. I asked him why he was asking. He said, "It's nothing." I let it go because we were on our 4th round and I was getting married in 2 weeks. Third, and this is the one that should have split me open. 2 weeks before the ceremony, my sister Clara brought up at dinner that she'd spotted someone near my building who looked like Lena. I laughed it off. "Lena's in Hamburg," I said. "Wrong person. Impossible." And Clara didn't respond to me. She looked at my mother. For exactly 1 second, Clara's eyes went to my mother's face, and my mother looked down at her plate and pressed her lips together slightly. And then someone passed the salad and the conversation moved on. I cataloged that look. I filed it under things to think about later. I had a seating chart with 6 unresolved family conflicts and a suit fitting in 36 hours, and I told myself I would come back to it. I have thought about that look every single day for almost a year. Because Clara wasn't checking on my mother's reaction to unexpected news, she was checking on my mother's reaction to information she had just accidentally confirmed. Back to the church. Lena walked forward. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't glance at the guests on either side. Just that slow, even walk down the center of the aisle. Our aisle, Mia's aisle. Like she had measured it in advance and knew exactly how many steps it would take. Every head had turned to track her. 200 people pivoting simultaneously, the rustle of it, the creak of pews. And underneath all of it, this terrible silence, because the string quartet had stopped. The quartet stopped. I hadn't even noticed the music ending. It had just ceased, mid-phrase. And in the silence that replaced it, you could hear everything. Shoes on stone. Someone's sharp exhale. One of Mia's bridesmaids whispering something too fast to catch. I looked at my mother. She had not turned around. Every single person in that church had turned to look at the back of the room except Ingrid, who sat in the front left pew with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes aimed at the altar like she was waiting for a sermon to resume. Like she knew exactly what was happening and had decided her role was to wait for it to finish. I felt something cold and specific move through me. Not panic, something worse, recognition. Lena stopped 10 feet from the altar. She looked at me, only at me, not at Mia, not at the priest, at me. "I'm sorry to be here," she said, in a voice calibrated to carry without being raised. "I genuinely am, but I've been sitting with this for 7 months, and I reached a point where I couldn't, in good conscience, stay quiet." Not a scream, not an accusation, just a woman apologizing for something she had very clearly come to do on purpose. "Lucas and I haven't been in contact," she said. "More than a year, no communication. But we did see each other 7 months ago, one night." A pause, precisely timed. "And there are things that came out of that night that I think the people in this room, especially Mia, deserve to know about before the ceremony goes any further." She stopped there, just stopped. Didn't say what the things were, didn't elaborate. Let things and "came out of that night" sit in the air above 200 people who were all now in the process of reaching the same conclusion. And I stood at that altar, and I could not immediately say she was lying, because she wasn't. Here's the thing I have never fully told anyone. 7 months before my wedding, on a Wednesday night at 1:45, Lena called me. I hadn't heard her voice in 9 months. She sounded strange, not manipulative strange, not her usual register. She sounded genuinely frightened, which was something I had never heard from her in 3 years. She said she was in the city. She was having some kind of breakdown. She was completely alone. She didn't know who to call. And I went. I got in my car at 11:45 at night and I drove to her. I told myself it was the decent thing to do. I told myself that abandoning someone in crisis was wrong, regardless of history. I stayed 2 hours. We talked. She cried, which I had almost never seen. I left. Nothing happened. But I drove home at 2 in the morning, and I lay down next to Mia, who was asleep, and I made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a moment I could point to with clarity, just a quiet, cowardly little choice. I decided not to say anything. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I knew how it looked. Midnight, her apartment, alone, 9 months after a difficult breakup. Even the true version of that story is a conversation I was afraid to have. So I buried it. I kept burying it, every single day for 7 months, under everything good I was building with Mia. And Lena had kept the night like an object, clean and sharp and patient. She hadn't told anyone. Not then. She'd simply waited to find the right room. And now, I was in it. Mia walked toward me. She moved slowly, the way you move when you're making yourself stay calm on purpose. She stopped maybe 18 inches away and looked up into my face with an expression I need to describe carefully, because it wasn't anger, and it wasn't grief, and it wasn't fear. It was comprehension. Active, real-time comprehension. She was reading me the way you read something you've suspected might say the wrong thing and are now discovering it does. "Lucas," she said, barely above a whisper. "Is she telling the truth about the 7 months?" I opened my mouth. A half-second passed. That half-second. That one involuntary pause while I calculated how to explain something I'd buried in a way that wouldn't make it worse. That gap between her question and my answer. Not guilt, but the unmistakable shape of someone managing information. I watched it land on her face like a physical thing. I watched something in Mia Fisher close. "Is there something I don't know?" she said. From somewhere behind us, the small mechanical click of a phone camera. Then another. Then 3 more in quick succession, like a species discovering something new. What followed was humiliation distributed across about 45 minutes in different forms, each one distinct. The priest stepped back. Just half a step, but it removed the ritual. Without him at the center, we were just people standing in a damaged room. Mia's father, Werner, quiet, large, the kind of man who had never once spoken an unkind word to me in 18 months, appeared at her side. He didn't look at me. He put one hand on her arm and gently redirected her, the way you'd move something precious out of reach of something dangerous. Tobias moved to physically intercept Lena. He positioned himself with his arms out slightly, blocking her path to the altar. He didn't yell. He just stood there, calm and deliberate, like someone who had thought about what he would do if this exact thing happened, which meant he had, which meant he had believed it was possible enough to make a plan. I would deal with that later. I had so many things to deal with later. I saw my Aunt Helga standing in her pew, hand over her mouth. I saw Mia's friend Sophie already crying, which was somehow the most surreal detail. Sophie was crying before Mia was. I saw my cousin filming on his phone with his arm raised like he was at a concert. Clara steered me toward a side hall. I went 3 steps, stopped, and turned back. My mother had still not moved. I crossed to her. I bent down. I put my face close to hers and I said, as quietly as I could while barely being able to form words, "Mama, what is happening?" She looked at me with dry, steady eyes. She said, "I needed you to see what you were throwing away." I spent the next 4 hours finding out the truth in pieces, and each piece was worse than the one before it. My mother had been in contact with Lena for 3 months. She'd reached out first, tracked down Lena's number through a friend, which took deliberate effort. She told me later she wasn't trying to ruin anything. She had doubts, real love underneath them. She thought I was moving from Lena to Mia the way you run from a burning building, without checking where you're landing. She wanted information, context. She wanted to understand who her son had been for 3 years. But you don't call Lena Brandt for context. Lena gave her the night. Not directly, she gave it sideways, in fragments, with careful pauses. She told the story with the same technique she'd used at the altar. No direct claims, just a shape that invited you to fill it in. And my mother, who was already worried, already primed, already convinced I was making a mistake, filled it in exactly the way Lena needed her to. And then my mother, believing she was protecting me, believing this would force me to confront something I'd been avoiding, had told Lena the venue, the date, the start time. She told me she hadn't invited her. She had mentioned the details and not asked her to stay away. She would like me to understand that those are different things. I'm telling you so you can decide for yourself whether they are. I found Lena in a small room behind the reception hall. Tobias sat in the corner because I asked him to be there. I did not trust myself with just the two of us. She was sitting with a glass of water. She looked like someone waiting for a delayed train, inconvenienced, mildly, patient. Tell me exactly what you said up there, I said, word for word. I said we saw each other 7 months ago. Her voice was neutral. I said there were things that came from that. I said they couldn't wait. She looked at me levelly. Tell me which part was a lie. You implied. I implied nothing. She tilted her head slightly. I said words that were true. What the room did with those words is not something I'm responsible for. What you did with those words, or couldn't do, that's the more interesting question. You knew exactly what you were doing. Yes, she said. Just that. No elaboration, no defense. Yes, I did. I wanted to hit her with something that would hurt. Everything I could think of was either too large or too small. And then she said the line that I hear when I'm trying to sleep. Here's what I know, Lucas. I walked into that church with nothing. No proof, no documents, no evidence. All I had was 6 words and a green dress. And in under a minute, your wedding was over. She looked at me without blinking. I didn't destroy anything that was solid. You know that. That's the part you can't say out loud yet. 10 seconds of silence. I couldn't answer. Because the worst thing, the thing I hate myself for most, is that for those 10 seconds, I didn't know if she was wrong. I found Mia in the bridal room. She'd sent everyone away. She was sitting on a low bench in her dress, and when I came in, she looked at me with a tiredness that was more frightening than any amount of anger. I sat down across from her and I told her everything. The phone call, the drive, the 2 hours, that nothing happened. That I made the choice not to tell her. That I convinced myself it was the merciful option. I told her about the look between Clara and my mother at dinner. I told her what my mother said at the front pew. I gave her all of it without a single softening detail. She listened without speaking. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long time. Then she said, I believe you that nothing happened. Something moved in my chest. But I need you to understand something, she said. I'm not ending this because of what Lena said in that church. I'm not even ending it because you went to her apartment that night. She held my gaze completely. I'm ending it because of every single morning after that. 7 months of waking up next to me, planning a life with me, letting me stand in a church in this dress and say vows to you. And in all of that, all of it, you never once decided I was the kind of person you could tell a hard thing to. She wasn't asking whether I'd been faithful. She was asking something I had no good answer for. She was asking whether I had ever actually trusted her, whether she had ever been, to me, more than someone I was afraid to disappoint. The stone in my throat said everything. The video went up 90 minutes later. Tobias texted me a link with no message. 37 seconds. Lena walking the aisle, Mia frozen in the background. My own face in the frame for 4 or 5 seconds. And I have watched those seconds more times than I can count, trying to identify exactly what I look like, and landing on the same answer every time. I look like a man realizing a wall he thought he'd built is made of paper. It spread the way those things spread. I still get sent versions of it by people who have no idea they're sending it to me. Clara cut off my mother that week. She told me later she'd been watching Ingrid for months, tracking questions that were too careful, noticing an orchestration she hadn't fully understood. The look at the dinner table. Clara had accidentally confirmed something my mother was assembling, and she'd known it the moment she saw my mother's face, and she hadn't known how to tell me without evidence. She blamed herself. I told her not to. She told me she would anyway. We are still, a year on, working through what it means that the people who loved me most all saw something coming, and none of us said the word out loud. Tobias told me my mother had called him 2 weeks before the wedding, asked if I'd mentioned Lena. He hadn't understood what he was confirming. He said he should have pushed harder when he asked me at the bachelor party. He's probably right. But I also think we were all operating inside the same problem. We each had a piece of information that felt incomplete on its own, and none of us wanted to be the person who said something that turned out to be nothing. My mother and I had our real conversation 3 weeks after. She said she was sorry for what happened. She was not sorry for what she intended. She told me she had never believed Lena's implication. She had never thought something physical had actually occurred. She just thought I needed to be confronted. She thought if I were forced to stand in the heat of my past, I would make a clearer choice about my future. She thought she was pressing me towards something. She didn't understand she was putting a lit match in the hands of someone who had been mapping my house for months. The specific grief of being catastrophically hurt by someone who is trying to love you is that you cannot hate them as cleanly as you need to. You hate them in small pieces, in between the moments you miss them. Mia and I tried. I want to say that. 2 months of trying, therapy, separately and together, late conversations, the kind that only happen at 3 in the morning when you're too exhausted for performance. There were moments that almost felt like ground. But she told me, eventually, that something had changed in how she saw my face. Not in a dramatic way, just every time I spoke, part of her was still standing at that altar, watching my expression, waiting to see whether I would hesitate. She said she didn't want to live checking me. She said she didn't think I wanted her to. She was right. And the way she said it, still careful, still fair, still trying to be accurate rather than cruel, that told me exactly who I had had and exactly what I had decided she couldn't hold. 4 months after the wedding that didn't happen, Lena left me a voicemail. I didn't pick up. I have played it exactly twice, and I don't think I'll play it again. She sounded like herself. Even, dry, no theatrics. She said, "I know you've made me into something simple in your head, something that explains the day cleanly. I need you to know that's not what I am." A pause. "I didn't come because I still wanted you. I didn't come to punish you. I came because I needed to know if I could, if I still had it. The thing I've always had. The ability to walk into a room and stop everything. And I did it. I walked in and the room stopped." Another pause. "And it felt like nothing. I stood there with everyone looking at me and it felt like absolutely nothing. Like I'd driven 4 hours to open a door and there was nothing behind it." Her voice didn't change. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with that ever since." That voicemail is the thing I return to when I'm tempted to make this story simple, because she was telling the truth. She wasn't there for love or jealousy or revenge in the pure sense. She was there for the confirmation of something in herself that she needed to prove. She found the proof, and it gave her nothing. Which means she burned my wedding down as a test she ran on herself. Which means my mother armed someone who didn't even particularly want to win. Which means I handed them both the material by spending 7 months choosing comfort over honesty and calling that choice love. There is no clean villain here. That's the thing I kept waiting to find and kept failing to. There's just a woman who turned up to confirm her own power and discovered it was hollow. There's a mother who was so afraid of watching her son repeat a mistake that she committed a larger one. And there's me, a man who looked at the person he loved most and decided, over and over, in small, quiet ways, that she wasn't someone he could be completely honest with. I told myself I was protecting her. I was protecting myself. And Mia Fisher, in a dress she'd chosen over 6 months, in a church full of people she'd invited to watch her begin a life, she stood at the center of all of it, and understood faster than anyone what was actually happening. And she was, from beginning to end, the most honest person in the room. I lost her somewhere in those 7 months. Not at the altar, not when Lena walked in, not even during that half-second pause. I lost her some quiet Tuesday night 7 months before the wedding when I drove home, lay down beside her in the dark, and made the decision to let the silence be enough. I just didn't know it was a decision at the time. I called it peace.